wait like Pastor Tim had. I'm Greg Zolnerwich. I'm very happy to be here. I see Joe Krauska. Jill, what I tell you? Joe's signed up. He's not here. He's always late. So
You're
Joe
right.
Krauska comes in. We all have to clap because I had Joe in my class last fall. And he was always late.
I'll let you know when he comes in. I'll start clapping.
So we're going to talk about insects today. If you looked at the guidelines in the Kansas Master Naturalist handbook, it's wildly optimistic, and it's more like a 6-month course of what they have in there. And if you look outside, we are not going to go rooting around in the cold looking for insects because they're out there, but we would freeze our tushes off trying to find them. So what I plan to do today is give you an overview and an appreciation of why insects are so successful, who they're related to, something about what they're experiencing out there in the natural world because they feel and sense a lot of things that we can't, and then a little bit about their roles out there and what they're doing making a living out in the ecological environment. Because they do a lot of things vertebrates do, but they do some really, really cool things that vertebrates do not do. And if we have enough time, we'll talk a little bit about insects and fire, because everyone likes to talk about burning stuff. Unfortunately, the insects get burned up too. So, why talk about entomology? It's just the study of insects, and we all have an entomological experience. Who in here has been stung by an ant, bee, or a wasp? Yes. Who in here buys food at Dillon's or Hi, Joe! Joe's here! Joe's late. Now we can start. What is entomology? So, when you buy your produce or your meat at Dillon's or Hy-Vee or whatever, you are paying extra. There's a built-in cost to your food because of the cost of insect damage or controlling insects. That is built into the cost of your food. How many people in here have a horse or have horses? Do you vaccinate your horses? For what? What do you vaccinate your horses against?
West Nile virus.
West Nile virus. Who in here has heard of Zika in the last week? Zika. Chikungunya, that's coming in. That's in Texas already and South Florida. So insects have an impact on us on a daily basis, even if you're not consciously aware of it. So this is why your taxes pay my salary, so we can talk about insects. And please interrupt me if you have any questions. If you learn nothing else today, or if you only remember one thing 6 months down the road, remember this. Most of the animals on this planet are insects. That number of species, and if you just counted them all up, number of individuals, it would be insects by far. Insects are arthropods. Those are all the things with an exoskeleton and jointed legs, and we'll look at those in a second. And insects are members of the arthropod group, and they make up most of the arthropods. The arthropods dominate life on this planet. So remember this. There are more species and individuals of insects than any other animal on the planet. This is a speciescape, and it shows the different groups of organisms on the Earth, and they're proportionally sized as to number of species that we know about on the planet. So if we look at insects, depending on what textbook you read, there's about 1 million insects represented by the praying mantis here. If you look at the non-insect arthropods, this is everything else. This is represented by the scorpion. So these two groups dominate the number of species on the planet. Okay, there's, here's the fish. Here's the octopi and squids. Here's the fungi. Here are the plants. Here's the reptiles. Where's my little frog? There's a frog. There's a frog in here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. Little tree frog. Birds. Sorry, Brett. Birds are pretty. Yeah. So, what are we? We're mammals. So, we're the little bison sitting there on the prairie. So, in relative number of species, insects dominate the landscape. The other thing to remember, insects are related to all other arthropods. So all these guys we're going to look at on the next few slides, and I have some live ones for us to look at. They're all related to each other. They're all cousins because they all have an exoskeleton that they crunch when you step on them, and they have jointed legs and a few other features. So the crustaceans. So there's about 50,000 crustaceans. And there are land crustaceans. This is a pill bug or a sow bug or a roly-poly. That's actually just a terrestrial crustacean. So who in here likes to eat crab, shrimp, and lobster? All right. How many people in here like to eat insects? There's really no difference. Grasshoppers are just aquatic, or just terrestrial lobsters, essentially. They're all the same. Arachnids are a huge group. Look at the number of species there. Very, very diverse. So this includes things like mice, scorpions, spiders, daddy longlegs, whip scorpions. All of those guys are arachnids. There's huge numbers of these. More arachnids. Our friend the tick, pseudoscorpions, sun spiders, tailless whip scorpions. A lot of very bizarre things. A lot of these are predators. A lot of them are beneficial in some way. A lot of them are parasites or can spread diseases. So when you're out there, don't think just about insects. Think about all these other terrestrial arthropods like the arachnids. We have not so many species of centipedes. These are all predators. These are actually cool. They're said to have a poisonous jaw, but their poisonous jaw is actually a modified front leg. So the front leg is evolved so the claw is hollow, and it's like a fang, and they actually have venom glands. And they actually grab and bite their prey with their front legs. And it's a painful bite. What's that?
Millipede.
Yeah, millipede. Yeah, so these are kind of like the gentle cattle of the arthropod world. They walk around scavenging on food. But all these are related to insects. They're all arthropods. They all have an exoskeleton. And think about that when we talk about molting, because these all have to shed their exoskeletons to molt. How many species of insects are there? Nobody knows. We can't even guess with an order of magnitude. Depending on what textbook you read, you'll see 3, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 million. Nobody knows. I think the upper ends are some pretty wild extrapolations based on fear-induced scientific inquiry in a bar. But you can find those numbers. But the insects are dominated by 4 groups. The ants, bees, and wasps, the flies, the beetles, and the butterflies and moths. These all have over 100,000 species. There's over 300,000 species of beetles that we know about right now. So these are the big 4 that dominate the insect world. And you can see that on this pie graph. So you have, these are all the species of insects. So you have beetles, Hymenoptera, flies, butterflies, and moths. So you've got the big 4 that really dominate the landscape. So let's translate this into some sort of biomass. If you took all the birds in, say, North America and squished them out with a steamroller, you'd have about 1 pound of bird per acre. How big is an acre? Very good. None of my students ever know that. All right, so 43,560 square feet. So if you squished all the birds, you'd have about 1 pound of bird per acre. Humans, you'd have 14 pounds per acre. Look at insects. In temperate zones, and we're a temperate zone, if you took all the biomass of insects out there and squished them out flat, you'd have 400 pounds of living flesh of insects per acre. And that goes really crazy down in the tropics. You'd have about a ton of insects per acre. And there's probably some translation or coefficient I could translate that into how many bison per acre that would be. Just for sheer numbers, this is a little hexapod or insect called the springtail. They've counted 100 million of these per square meter in very rich soil. Just number of individuals. This is a swarm of desert locusts. This is not a dust storm, these are locusts. And some of these big swarms, you literally have 1 million pounds of insects that are in the air, flying around looking for food. This is a picture I grabbed off a newspaper website in Pennsylvania. This is last fall. This is a swarm of mayflies. Such numbers, they had to close this bridge for 2 days because they were piled up in such numbers. All the cars were running over them and making the bridge slippery and causing wrecks. So you can have huge numbers of insects in a relatively small area. Don't memorize this. This will not be on the quiz. But insects have been around for a very, very long time, about 400 million years. And this is a geologic timetable. Y'all done geology yet?
No.
Are they doing geology?
They are doing it, but not yet.
So, 400 million years. So if you think about how do you define the success of a group of organisms, you can define success as how many species are there, and insects have a lot. But you can also define success as how long has it existed on the planet. Mammals, relatively recent. Birds, relatively recent. Insects are very, very old. They predate the dinosaurs. So if we look down here where the insects first appear in the fossil record, that's about 400 million years. Here's the Mesozoic. This is the age of dinosaurs. So they predate the dinosaurs by many, many, many millions of years. There's a lot of insects we know that evolved, flourished, and then went extinct. So that's not something we often think about. There's a lot of insects that are very unlike the insects we see today that are no longer here. They evolved, but then for some reason they died out. Sort of the big steps in the evolution of insects was the evolution of wing folding, which we'll talk about, and then having a whole metabolism or complete life cycle, egg, larva. We'll talk about that. But the early insects could not fold their wings over the back of the body, and mayflies and dragonflies still can't. So when they're not flying, their wings are out like this. That's great for flying, but you're not going to crawl under rocks or through grass and things like that. They had a primitive articulation between the wing and the body. So the later insects evolved essentially a third structure, a more complex hinge that allows them to fold and pleat the wing and swing them back over the body. This was a huge step. This lets insects get into a lot more niches and small places than any insect that can only hold its wings straight out from the body. Who knows where Elmo, Kansas is? Where? Yeah, it's about an hour southwest of here. So at one point, Kansas was covered with seed, and then the seed retreated, and a lot of insects were fossilized in the sedimentary layers after the seeds went away. This is a very, very famous, essentially a dragonfly wing that was collected at Elmo. This is Floyd Holmes. He was a grad student. He collected it about 300 years ago because he's really, really old. But there are a lot of very famous insect fossils known from Elmo. And this is Frank Carpenter from Harvard. He did a lot of work. And this dragonfly wing is in our insect zoo. And it's about 11 inches long. So that dragonfly almost had a 2-foot wingspan, which is pretty darn cool. That would be awesome to see flying around. So insects are very, very old. Sometimes they were much larger than they are today. And there's a lot of very, very well-known fossil insects. Fluorescent Colorado is another very famous insect fossil. So, why are they successful? They've been around for so long. There's so many species of them. What is it about insects, particularly, that make them so successful, as we have defined success? One is they're small. Insects, a lot of the biodiversity of insects is going to be 10 millimeters or less. You know, we all go ooh and ah when a big grasshopper or regal fritillary flies by. But a lot of insects are small, and they tend to escape our notice. Also, we tend to be very vertebrate-oriented. We notice the big furry things and things with feathers. So how small are they? Some of them are 0.5 millimeter or smaller. This is a wasp I took a photo of through my microscope. This is a 1 millimeter ruler. So this wasp is about 1 millimeter long. Very small. Here are 3 little wasps on a dime. And you can go out with a net and collect hundreds and hundreds of those on a nice day. And they're all out there, but they tend to escape our notice just because of their size. So because they're small, they don't use a lot of energy. They don't need to feed a lot because they're not investing in a lot of growth of body tissue. Lets them get away from a lot of predators and things like that. And they can get into very, very small places. They have found insects higher than Mount Everest, essentially floating like aerial plankton. Deep underground, just about every ecological zone you can think of, you can find insects there. They even have insects, in Antarctica. Not many, but they are there. So they're investing their energy in reproduction. Insects can be very, very prolific. So they're not taking the time to have these gigantic bodies. They're taking their energy, growing, and putting those into reproduction. So small size. Small size often means they can reproduce faster. So fast population growth, which means they evolve rapidly. So let's look at some bison out here on Konza. When does a bison reach reproductive age?
3 years.
3 years, 4 years? Yeah. So they're around for a couple years, and then they'll have a calf, and they'll maybe have another calf next year. So it's a fairly slow generation time. What about humans? So hopefully not when they're teens, but we reach reproductive age, after 12, 13, 14 years of life. Then we can start reproducing. A lot of insects have an annual life cycle. So things like grasshoppers, they'll have 1 generation per year, which is pretty standard for a lot of insects. But it's much faster compared to vertebrates that might take 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 years to reach a reproductive age, and then might have 1 offspring every year. This grasshopper might lay 100 eggs and have those hatch out next year. Some insects have a very fast life cycle. Some flies, 10 days to 2 weeks. So if that fly reproduces and makes 100 flies, and 2 weeks later those 100 make 100, in about a month the earth would be covered with flies, literally, if they all survive. So very fast generation times. And that means they evolve faster. So every time something reproduces, its offspring is genetically different. And that's evolution. So compared to the lifetime of a lot of vertebrates, insects are reproducing faster and they're also evolving faster. They can also adapt and change much faster than a lot of slower growing vertebrates. Questions? Yeah, Joe.
With the 11-inch wingspan of that dragonfly, it's related to dragonfly things, but how long did they estimate that the body was?
There's been some models about like that. That would be awesome. I always thought it was a shame tarantulas never grew wings, because that would be totally awesome. So we have small size, we have fast generation time, and then we have metamorphosis, which I had mentioned before. The most diverse groups of insects, when I was a kid we learned this as a complete life cycle. So when a grasshopper hatches, the grasshopper looks like a little baby grasshopper, then it molts and it looks like a bigger grasshopper, and it goes through its molts and reaches adulthood. For the insects that have a complete metamorphosis, they actually have a division of life stages that's very efficient. So you have an egg, which has everything that the developing embryo needs to develop, all the food and nourishment. There's little air holes so it gets oxygen. And this is very resistant. There's a lot of insects out there right now overwintering as eggs. So it's a resistant life stage, and the embryo is developing. When that hatches, then you have a larva, in this case this caterpillar. Every time you see a caterpillar, what's it doing?
Eating.
It's eating. Yes, it's eating and it's pooping and it's growing. So this is a feeding stage, and they're accumulating enough energy for the pupal stage. And this is the transformation stage. where a lot of the body is completely reorganized. And then you have the adult stage, and this is for reproduction, in some cases dispersal. And there's massive changes that take place here. So for this caterpillar, the legs are changing, the digestive system is changing, the mouth parts are changing, the flight muscles are changing, and they essentially can digest and recycle much of the proteins and body tissues into the adult form. And this is one reason why the beetles and the flies and the ants, bees, and wasps and the Lepidoptera are so dominant. This division of life stages. Exoskeleton. All of the arthropods have an exoskeleton. And this is great stuff. This is like super Play-Doh. You can do anything with it. So it's protection. So think of this as sort of a suit of armor. Everything you see in this photo is exoskeleton. It completely covers the outside of the insect. Like Play-Doh, you can mold it into just about anything. Anyone ever have those little Play-Doh factories where you press the Play-Doh out and make all the shapes? That's the same thing. You can make spikes and spines or flexible antennae or horns and things like that. You can make some very, very complex structures. And as I said, all of this is exoskeleton that you can see. Where the exoskeleton is soft, you have joints, and this allows for movement. So the head can move. Each of these antennae can move. There's about 6 mouth parts made of exoskeleton that can move. So there's areas of weakness or flexibility in this suit of armor that lets the arthropods and the insects actually move around. What animals can fly? Besides insects.
Bats.
Bats, good. What else? Birds. What else? That's it. No, squirrels are just falling into grace. That's it. They're gone. So, and birds are just flying dinosaurs. So, really, there's only 3 groups of animals that have evolved the power of flight. And this is key in the success of insects. They beat the birds by 150 million years. And bats, being mammals, they're relatively recent also. So these are the early flyers in the history of our planet. We'll talk a little bit more about flight and wings. I mean, if you have to, go to Dallas, Texas, would you rather drive or would you rather fly? It's much faster than flying. It's a much more efficient way of getting. And we'll talk about wings and flying coming up. Complex behaviors. Insects are not rocket scientists, but they do some very, very sophisticated things with a pretty small brain. So things like termites that are social insects, they can build some very complex mounds that a civil engineer would emulate, and they're actually starting to do this in some places in Africa. Very sophisticated heating and ventilation in these tall mounds that might be 20 feet high, built by little tiny insects like this. Honeybees, of course, are known for building their hives, but they have very sophisticated behaviors. Who has a GPS in their car or on their phone? Okay. So, Don, what does GPS tell you?
In relation to the Earth.
Where you are. What else does it tell you?
Where you want to go?
Where you want to go, and what else does it tell you? How to get there and how far away it is. That's what a GPS does. Honeybees do that also. So when they do a dance that tells their fellow hive mates where the food is, they're telling how far the food is, the energy needed to get there, which translates as distance, what direction to fly in relation to the sun, and the quality of the food. So they're passing along very, very sophisticated information that we have only had that technology to do mechanically, for not a very, very long time. A lot of insects have mutualistic interactions. This is an ant. These are aphids. A lot of insects suck plant sap, and they excrete a lot of sugary water that the ants use as a food source. So the ants treat the aphids essentially like dairy cows. They'll protect them from predators and parasites. Some ants use their stinger and they make a chemical trail around the aphids like a fence. It's essentially a chemical fence, so the aphids will stay corralled. Some ants will place the aphids on the younger portion of the plant that's more actively growing. So that's very, very sophisticated behavior. This is a jewel wasp. This is really cool. I like parasitic wasps, so you're going to hear about this. This wasp will sting a cockroach, and it places a neurotoxin with its stinger in a very specific portion of the cockroach's brain. And that alters the cockroach's behavior, and it becomes docile. And at this point, the wasp takes the cockroach by the antenna, and it leads it like a dog on a leash to its burrow. It'll place it in the burrow, and then it usually bites the end of the antenna off and drinks a little of the cockroach blood for a little nourishment. And then it lays an egg on the cockroach, and the wasp egg will hatch, and the wasp larva will eat the cockroach. Think about that. Do you know any vertebrate that does anything that's half cool as that? Sting a specific portion of the brain, inject a chemical that changes the behavior of the cockroach, and lead it around, drink its blood, and then lay an egg on it. That's just too cool. And then there's coevolution with the flowering plants. And on that geological table, I should point that out, you see the rise of plants and great diversification in the plants that corresponds with the period in time where the insects really started to diversify. And there's a lot of debate of, did flowering plants drive the evolution of insects, or did insects drive the evolution of flowering plants? And it's two sides of the same coin. It's coevolution, where you have diversity of insects driving diversity of the plants and vice versa. So, of course, a lot of insects feed on plants, and plants evolve chemicals to defend against that. They can actually change the insect's behavior, they can deter insects, they make some insects lay fewer eggs with the plant chemicals. In turn, the insects have evolved, and some of them use the plant chemicals, and they incorporate those plant chemicals as part of their chemical defense of the insect. Some of them use those plant chemicals to make their pheromones for reproduction. So you have this constant evolutionary arms race between plants and the herbivores that feed on it. And then you have pollinators, where a lot of insects either pollinate many plants, or they've evolved to pollinate just a few very select types of plants. And there are some plants that are dependent on only one or two species of insect that pollinate them. So at this point, they're almost an evolutionary dead end. If that plant becomes extinct, that insect would become extinct. If that insect became extinct, the plant would have no natural pollinators and would likely become extinct. So they're mutually dependent on each other. That's several of the reasons why. That's right. The insects are getting pollen as a source of protein, and nectar as a source of carbohydrates. So, and it works out very well for both groups. Yeah. So the insects aren't doing that out of altruism. So let's get back to the concept of the exoskeleton. So our skeleton is on the inside. So we're squishy on the outside and hard on the inside. And it's the opposite with insects. So when you step on an insect, they crunch because their exoskeleton is on the outside. And as I said, this is essentially a suit of armor with a lot of joints in it that allow for movement. So you have armor. Some insects are so hard, you actually can poke an insect pin, and the end of the pin will curl up. Their exoskeleton is so very, very hard. Some insects, the hardest part of the mandibles, and some insects can actually chew through things like copper. They can actually be a pest if they get into copper wire or lines. They're also very good at preventing water loss. Small things tend to dry out very, very quickly. And insects have a lot of wax layers and other things on the exoskeleton. So when you wax your car, what happens when it rains? Yeah, it beads up. Yeah, so it's keeping water from penetrating into your paint. What these waxy layers on the exoskeleton do for insects is they keep the water inside. Because insects often have to be concerned about drying out because they're so small. Muscle attachments. So even though they have an exoskeleton, and here's just a diagram of an exoskeleton, all of this is non-living. So everything you see on this beetle, that's exoskeleton. It's non-living material. The exoskeleton is actually secreted by a layer of cells inside the body here, and it secretes these layers of exoskeleton. So everything you see is non-living tissue, it's non-living material. But there are large areas where the exoskeleton invaginates or pokes down into the body cavity. And this is where things like muscles can attach, ligaments can attach, tissues that support the organs can attach. So even though they have an exoskeleton, there are points where the exoskeleton sticks into the body, just like if you stuck your finger into a balloon, where it makes really good area to support motion. And as I said, it's just like Play-Doh. You can form so many different structures, and you can literally mold it into just about any conceivable shape. And it lets insects fly. Wings are just 2 layers of exoskeleton pressed together. That's all a wing is. 2 layers of non-living exoskeleton pressed together. And for most insects, when they fly, it's actually the flexing of the thorax that drives the wings. It's not like there's a pulley and a rope attached to the base of it. So wing flying, key component of being having an exoskeleton. Life is a series of compromises, and it's not a perfect world, and you have to work with what nature or evolution has provided for you. And the disadvantage here is that to grow this suit of armor, you have to cast it off or molt it and get rid of it. And here you've all probably seen cicadas molting or their cast exoskeleton hanging on trees or fences. So this is the problem with having an exoskeleton. You've got to shed it in order to increase in size. As I said, that's known as molting. And it's a very critical time for an insect because it's totally helpless. This might take several minutes, it might take an hour, depending on the insect. Any predator can come along and nab that while it's molting because it can't get away, it can't run, it can't fly, it can't swim away. So once this is out, notice how pale this is. This new exoskeleton is soft. And this is the point where the insect can increase in size. So they can swallow air, they can pump blood through the appendages and physically increase in size. And then after a period of time, certain proteins kick in and the exoskeleton starts to harden, and then usually it gets darker. And then you're in that suit of armor once again. Think about this.
Greg?
Yes.
How many cycles might they go through to expand?
The really primitive insects do this through their whole lifetime, so they might do it 30 or 40 times. Most insects that we see, like grasshoppers and dragonflies and beetles and things, they usually have 3 to 5 molts. So evolutionarily, the number of molts has gone down. So for most insects that you see, it's 3 to 5 times. Now, think about a 20-pound lobster in the water doing that. They have to do it. Think about a millipede with 100 legs. They have to do that. Every leg has to come out just right. If something goes wrong, or if the leg gets hung up, and they have to drag that old exoskeleton around, they're not going to last very long. So it's a very, very critical process in the life of any arthropod. The other problem with having this type of body is because of the respiratory system, which is essentially a series of tubes and ducts, and they molt these tubes. So these white lines are the breathing tubes of this cicada. That works best with a smaller body. So you're not going to see a 800-pound insect because it wouldn't be able to breathe. I have a little clip we'll show part of. So this is, I will just kind of flip through this. This is a cicada molting. It's not bad for an amateur video. So you've seen all these guys crawling up on trees and fences and stuff. So it's spent its life underground, and it's time to turn into the adult. And it's going to split its exoskeleton. And this is the adult emerge. You see how flexible it is. Here's the old exoskeleton. It's got to get everything out just right. Kind of like watching a bad birth. So it's very, very soft. It's very, very vulnerable. we got the legs out. I want to back up just a little bit. Notice how the wings are all crumpled and folded. So once it's out, it'll have to pump blood through the wings and get those inflated to flying size. These white tubes are the old part of the respiratory system. Those get molted. And just as an aside, they also molt the front and back of the digestive system. And that's got to feel really weird. Just imagine shedding your colon 3 or 5 times. So we've got we're pretty much out. Notice how the wings are inflating. They can actually pump blood through these veins. So there are air tubes and blood flowing through those. The exoskeleton will start to harden. It will get darker. And then there's pretty much our final product, and it can fly off and make.
Will those tubes pinch off kind of like a umbilical cord, sort of like the...
Yeah, the trachea.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, a very slow and very vulnerable process, particularly if you have a lot more legs. So, who's our biggest guy? We said insects are small. The really big ones, they're about as big as a quarter-pound McDonald's patty, about 4 ounces. And these guys can still fly, but they're really heavy. They actually have to sit on the ground and beat their wings and warm their muscles up to reach flying time. You know, several inches long. There are walking sticks that are a foot long, but they're very, very slender. There are butterflies in Southeast Asia with about a 1 foot wingspan. So, but they're not very heavy. So you're really, your big meaty guys, they're going to be about, they're several inches long and about 4 ounces. And here's the physics of size. The weight becomes a limiting factor. So you will never see Mothra flying around. I grew up on those movies. And you'll never see things like this out on Konza. Why is that? Why can't we have bigger insects? Who in here works out? All right. Can you bench press?
Barely, yeah.
Oh, what do you bench press?
125.
125. And how much do you weigh?
About 150 pounds.
I learned never ask this question of a female.
Thank you.
150 pounds?
So you weigh 150 pounds and you can bench press not quite your own weight. All right. So these football players, in college and the pros, these guys weigh 300 pounds and they can bench press, like 600 pounds, maybe 700 pounds. They can maybe lift twice their weight. The problem is, if you double the diameter of the muscle, you double the strength. So if my guns were twice as big, I could lift twice as much, but it would be 3 times heavier. And this is why you don't see gigando insects like this, like these guys. If the muscles were bigger, they'd be stronger, but they'd also be 3 times heavier for every time you double the size of the muscle, double the diameter. So they literally couldn't move around. But because they're small, a lot of insects can lift 100 times their weight. I think the latest thing was a type of beetle that could pull 1,000 times its weight, which would be like you pulling a couple of double-decker buses. But we can't do that because it's just a physics, a limitation of physics. So where do you find the biggest arthropods?
In the
The
water.
really big guys.
Water
Water, that's right. Why do you find them in water?
displaces the weight.
That's right, the water supports the weight. So you can have a 20-pound lobster, but the water supports the weight of the lobster. If you took this 20-pound lobster and stuck it on this floor, it couldn't walk. It would be too heavy. So that's why you find the really big arthropods out in water, and why you don't see 50-pound insects walking around. So let's mention wings, then we'll take a break here shortly. So wings, we mentioned flight. These are just lateral outgrowths of the exoskeleton. There's no muscles directly attached that drive them. And most insects have two pairs of wings on the second and third segments of the thorax. Everyone probably knows that. But let's look at what wings do, because they do a lot of different things. Excellent mobility. It's much more efficient to fly from point A to point B than to walk over the ground. So if you're looking for a mate, if you're looking for food, if you're trying to get away, flying is the way to go. So it's great for getting to your food. A lot of insects use their wings in courtship displays or to find a mate. Or once they have found a mate, a lot of insects will have a mating flight, and a lot of them even mate while flying up in the air. So wings are good for that. Thermal regulation. So insects are cold-blooded, and they don't have very good control over their body temperature, but they can control it to an extent. So these are honeybees on a hot day, and they'll line up and they'll fan their wings at the entrance of the hive, and they'll blow air through the hive to help keep it cool. And on cold mornings, you might see butterflies or dragonflies orienting themselves to the sun. So they've got their wings spread, and they're trying to suck up some solar radiation to get their bodies warmed up. So it can be a heat gathering device. Aquatic insects can use their wings as a gill. So here's an aquatic beetle, and you see this bubble. And underneath the wings are the respiratory openings to the body. So there's air trapped under that wing. And as long as there's air under there with that little bubble, oxygen will diffuse from the water into that bubble. And that insect can stay essentially under the water as long as it has that little bit of air trapped under the wing. So it's essentially functionally like a gill. But if it loses that bubble in the air under its wing, it's got to go up and replenish it, or it'll wind up drowning. And a lot of insects use their wings to make sound for communication. We'll talk about sound coming up. So when you see out at night, there are crickets, usually males, with their wings up, and they're calling the females into finding their territory. So wings are not just for flying. So how do they actually fly? They could do this all day and not go anywhere. So they're actually twisting their wings in a figure 8 pattern. And when they do this, they're actually creating a vortex that provides a lot of the lift. If you've ever seen a jet take off or land on kind of a foggy day, you see these kind of swirly vapor trails off the edge of the wing. That's a vortex, and that provides a lot of the lift. And I've got a couple of clips of this. I like stuff before. So here's a slow-mo, slowed down 1/66 normal speed of a moth flying, hovering. And note the way the wings are going. They're doing that figure 8. So if you sped that up 66 times, that would be the normal flight. But notice how it can hold itself in a perfectly stationary position. Humans are just now developing some of the drone technology that actually fly nearly as well as insects. Nothing we've invented can fly as well as an insect yet. I don't care about you. And I wanted to show just another pair. So this is a bee. There was some German physicist calculated that bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly based on the size of the wing, but obviously they do. This is a great website, Ultra Slow. If you like things like the bullet going through an apple and making it explode, or like a match lighting, they have a lot of birds flying. They have a lot of like 5,000 to 10,000 frame per second video clips of a lot of natural things. So notice how this bee is taking off. You see the figure 8 shape. And it's going to actually kind of turn. You can see the wings are attacking the air at a different angle. are short wings with a pretty chunky body. So insects can fly forwards, backwards, they can land upside down. And then just one more quickie of the ladybug taking off. So you see the front wings pop out, the hind wings that were folded up go away at. The hind wings were folded up and they pop out and take their shape. The front wings are pretty useless for flying. The hind wings are doing all the work. And evolutionarily, this is the trend that you see in insects. One pair of wings or one functional pair. So you see in dragonflies, both wings do the flying. Ditto for mayflies. But in grasshoppers, you see the front wing is now a hard cover, and it's the hind wings that do the flying. Same thing for beetles. These aren't contributing anything to flight. These are now protective covers, and it's the hind wings that are doing the flying. Butterflies and moths, they couple their wings together so they act as one unit. Flies have lost their hind wings. They're another structure now. They fly with the front wings. And then the ants, the bees, and the wasps, they actually have little hooks that hook the front and the hind wing together, so they function as a single unit. So it's much more efficient to have one pair of wings than two pairs of wings. Huh? Yes, they do. Not very aerodynamic.
No.
So, where are we? So, how fast are we going? Oops, I still got a video. So how fast are they beating and how fast are they flying? Well, these are wing beats per second. Dragonflies, pretty slow. You can actually see each wing beat of a butterfly very, very often. Honeybees, faster. Look at mosquitoes. Almost 600 wing beats in a second. Try blinking your eyes. How fast can you blink your eyes? You can't do that. You can't do even 10 per second. Yeah, Larry.
What would be the bird?
Oh, how fast do birds beat their wings?
A hummingbird.
A hummingbird. Oh, hummingbirds really fast. Yeah, it's got to be on the order of hundreds.
In comparison to those.
I would say on the order of hundreds, and I'll Google that during the break. So, and that's why you hear mosquitoes at that. When a mosquito's flying around, that's the high-pitched sound of its wings beating so fast. Well, how fast does this translate to? Dragonflies, 18 miles an hour, bees, 13. Housefly, only 4. But people think flies are so fast. But that's just a matter of size. So when there's a housefly flying across the room at 4 miles an hour, you say, wow, look how fast that fly is going. If there was a hippopotamus floating across the room at 4 miles an hour, you would say, look how slow that hippopotamus is. Forget that it's floating across the room. But it's just a matter of size. The fastest one are the deer flies and the horse flies at about 25 miles an hour. I have read reports where horse flies could go 80 miles an hour, but I really question it. So this is the best info, most reliable info. But it's still a fantastic way to get around. We'll see a slide later on, but one of my grad students is putting radio transmitters on bees and tracking them across the prairie and then chasing them with antenna. And even a bee going 10 miles an hour over Konza Prairie, within 30 seconds it's out of sight, and we're running up and down, chasing it. And one more thing about wings. All these veins in the different groups of insects have names. They're all evolutionarily derived from common structures. So they're homologous. But it's very important for identification for a lot of groups of insects. So which veins are present, the branching pattern that they have, very, very useful for identification of different groups of insects. So your take home on wings is they open up huge new areas for insects, and they do a lot of things just besides flying.
It is 10:15. It's all yours.
Yay, back. Okay, so we looked at wings and all the things they do and sort of how they operate. Now let's look at mouth parts, because you can tell a lot about an insect if you look at the mouth parts and see what they have. Now remember, all this is based on exoskeleton, and you can mold that exoskeleton into just about any shape you want. So here's a grasshopper's head and side view, and there's a whole raft of mouth parts packed in here. And if you go from front to back, there's essentially a structure called a labrum, which is like an upper lip, and then there's mandibles, and then there's two things called maxillary palpi that have some finger-like movable extensions, and then there's something called the labium, which is at the back. Think of that as kind of the lower lip. And if you explode those out, you have the upper lip, you have the mandibles that move in and out this way, and then you have, these are sort of accessory jaws, and then you have that lower lip. So when a grasshopper or a beetle or something is feeding, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've got 6 different parts moving in a coordinated fashion to chew up their food. These are chewing mouth parts. This is your basic plan for insects. This is sort of like the Chevy Impala of mouth parts. You know, nothing special or extraordinary about it. But if you look at something like this, does this look like an herbivore or a predator? Yeah, this is not going to be chewing on grass. This is going to be catching things and chomping them up with those mandibles. Depending on the biology of the insect, you can sort of hang your mouth parts in any direction. So a lot of herbivores have their mouth parts directed down like that. I kind of think of a cow. A lot of predators have the mouth parts that are actually swung forward so they project in front. Because if you're catching live things, the first thing you want is your jaws out there in front of you. And then a lot of plant-feeding insects that have piercing, sucking mouth parts, they actually are way at the very, very back of the head because they're sitting on the plant, tapping into it like a soda straw. So they don't need anything sticking out in front. And you can change all these things very much like a Swiss Army knife to feed on different types of food. So you can adapt this basic chewing mouth part in a number of different ways. So these are big right now. These have what are called chewing lapping mouth parts. And here's the chewing part. Here are the mandibles. So they're very good for chewing. They can pick things up. They can maneuver things around. And the lapping part is the maxillae and the labium. And when the bee is not drinking or feeding, these swing up behind the head, kind of like the landing gear on an airplane. And when the bee flies down to a food source, these swing down, and then it can lap up nectar or lap up water. And it almost looks just like a dog drinking from the water bowl. So those are chewing lapping, and this can be carried to the extreme in some of the tropical bees. So these are the mouth parts, chewing lapping mouth parts. Here are the mandibles, and this is the very long lapping. So you can imagine these are going into some very, very deep. A lot of insects have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they've taken that basic chewing set of mouth parts and stretched them out into something that can pierce a food source and then suck up whatever the nutrient is. So you see this in the true bugs. So here's a stink bug, and it's got its mouth parts inserted into some sort of fruit. Of course, mosquitoes, which are blood feeders. A lot of things like fleas, some other things that pierce their food source. And you can take those basic chewing mouth parts, stretch them out into something that pierces. The labium, that back lip, this big fat part here, that acts as a sheath. So if you think about a sword in a scabbard, this would be the scabbard or the sheath. And usually these things are penetrating the food source. And the way insects have evolved, there's a two-way flow into and out of the food source. So if we look at this true bug, this could be a stink bug. Here's the labium, that lower lip that's now very long, and that's this portion here. It's a sheath. And the mandibles and the maxillae are now drawn out, and the way they fit together in sort of a tongue and groove arrangement, this is the part that pierces the food source. And there's a food channel and a salivary channel. So as this insect is feeding, it's injecting saliva or other chemicals into the food source while it's sucking up the actual food. So there's a two-way flow going up and down, and these are very, very narrow and hair-like. So what are they feeding on? So a lot of plant feeders. So here you see the labium bent out of the way. There's the four stylets. They're injecting things that can dissolve cell walls, or they might be tapping into the xylem or the phloem veins of the plant. Predators. So here's this is a relative of the wheel bug. So here's an assassin bug. It's nailed, a plant bug. So this is a predator. It's injecting enzymes like hyaluronidase. Those dissolve the cell membrane. So it's essentially liquefying its prey and then sucking out liquefied contents of its prey. Those hurt like the dickens. The most painful insect experience I had was in Mexico when one of those relative of one of those guys bit me on the finger. And it felt like someone had shoved a burning hot needle. And then for a couple of years, you could actually see a scar where its mouth parts went in, and it melted, you know, this little track inside my finger. I said a few choice words. Blood feeders, like bed bugs and fleas, while they're sucking blood, they're also injecting anticoagulants, because you know they don't want your blood clotting while their mouth parts are. And this is what gives you that reaction. So when a flea bites you, you get that little red itchy spot. That's your body's reaction to all the saliva, anticoagulants, and other things that the flea injected into. Mosquitoes take this to the extreme. When a mosquito bites, so here's the labium, bent out of the way, they actually have 6 parts that fit together that penetrate the skin. Very, very highly evolved, very, very sophisticated. A lot of people never actually feel a mosquito biting them. But they also have a salivary channel and the food channel. So they're injecting anticoagulants while they're sucking up your blood. And if you look at the business end up close, so this is magnified, this is the maxilla magnified 2,000 times and 7,500 times. This is what's cutting into your skin. But at such a fine level, a lot of people never feel a mosquito bite them. There's actually some recent YouTube videos. Some guys had a mosquito biting a section of the mouse skin, and you can actually see the individual cells in the skin of the mouth, of the mouth and the capillary. You can actually see these twisting around individual cells to tap into a capillary in the mouse skin. So very, very fine control once they get inside. You can have an ultimate reduction of mouth parts like you see in butterflies and moths. So essentially what these guys have, they're drinking nectar, and this is essentially a soda straw. So when they're not drinking, their proboscis is coiled up under the head, and they can extend it for when they're sipping nectar. This is all just a very long part of the maxilla, and they've lost most of the other mouth parts. They're just not there anymore, or they're very, very tiny and highly reduced, and you don't see them at all. So they've gone from a chewing mouth part to a very, very simplified, and this is really just 2 subparts of those chewing mouth parts. Flies, a lot of flies have what are called spongy mouth parts, and they're only feeding on liquid or very, very fine food particles that are suspended in the liquid. So the hypopharynx, think of that sort of as a tongue. Insects have their salivary glands actually in their thorax. So there's a tube that carries the saliva from the thorax through the neck, dumps it out there in the mouth area. And these guys are liquefying their food, or drinking liquid food. So if it's Don's birthday and you know some fly flies in, he's going to regurgitate saliva on the cake icing and liquefy it. And then it slurps it up. It's a very fine tubule, and then it slurps it up into the mouth.
I don't think I may be caking.
If you ever watched the movie The Fly, where he regurgitates and melts the guy's arm with a shotgun, that's sort of what they're doing. Horsefly, who's been bitten by a horsefly or a deer fly? Yeah, those suckers hurt like a dick. They have cutting, sponging mouth parts, so it's kind of a hybrid. Here's the cutting portion. These are the mandibles and the maxilla. So they slice the skin, and then they use this as part of the labium. They sponge it up with this. So they have a cutting component and a sponging. And they sponge up the blood as it pulls up in the slices. So you can take your basic Chevy Impala grasshopper chewing type mouth part, and these are color coded. So this red is this red. This red is this structure, the labrum. The green is the mandibles. You can modify all of these into these different shapes for feeding on different types of food. They're all the same structure, just highly modified through the course of evolution in biology. So how do we know what all these parts have come from? Because if you look at the larvae, they have perfectly fine chewing mouth parts. So this caterpillar has all the mouth parts the grasshopper has, and it chews its food just like a grasshopper. When it pupates, it loses most of those, and elongates two little bits to make that proboscis. Here's a mosquito larva, basic chewing mouth parts, but once again, when it pupates, it's stretching all those out into that very elaborate set of 6 parts that fit together to pierce skin. So a lot of times what you see in the insects with complete life cycle is larvae and adults often have very, very different food sources, which can help reduce competition. Think about a caterpillar chewing on a plant, but the adults are feeding on things like nectar or fruit juices. And this allows insects to enjoy a lot of different niches and a lot of different food sources just from modifying those basic chewing. So let's quick look at legs. A lot of insects have what's called a cursorial or a running leg. And you can see that on cockroaches and beetles, things like that. It's your basic walking and running leg. Nothing special about it. These are the fastest runners. Tiger beetles are the fastest runners in the insect world. How fast can they go? About 5 miles an hour, full speed, which translates to about 120 body lengths per second. This is the fastest human, Usain Bolt. He can run 6 body lengths per second, or 27 miles an hour. So think about that. If you scaled up this tiger beetle to the size of a human, he would be running probably about 400 miles an hour. If you ignore all the physics about weight and stuff like that. But on a scale-to-scale comparison, this guy is literally running hundreds of miles per hour compared to Usain Bolt. What does that look like?
Praying mantis.
Yeah, you can take this very basic leg, and note also there's 1, 2, 3, 4 main segments, and you can have 3 to 5 tarsal segments at the very end of the claw. But you have all these leg segments that have to be coordinated. But you can take those basic leg segments, just like the chewing mouth parts, and modify them. So if you take this very short coxa, the first segment, stretch it out, put a long femur on it, stick some teeth on there, you have a very fine grasping organ, which is very good for catching prey. Very, very long coxa, very, very good reach. Of course, you can take this leg, pump up the femur, pack in some muscles, make it look like a turkey drumstick, and you have a very, very good jumping leg. A lot of power packed into that leg. When those muscles move, they transmit the force down through the leg to make a grasshopper jump. Oh, great digging leg. This is a mole cricket. You find these in sandy soil. Look at those front legs. That's essentially a short, muscular, earth-moving piece of equipment. And these are very, very good for tunneling or digging through sandy soil. So you can tell a lot about an insect by looking at the mouth parts. You can tell something about it by looking at the legs. Something about what it's doing. or you can make sort of an educated guess about what it's doing out. Take a leg, stretch it out, make it long and slender, and you have a natatorial or swimming leg, just like that rowing leg. You can hang pollen on it. So here's a honeybee, and a lot of the bees have a flattened area where they can pack pollen on. They have little rakes and combs. So when bees are flying around and you see all the pollen attached to the body hairs, they'll take their right hind leg and comb the left side of the body, and these little rakes on the hind leg gather the pollen up, and then they pack it into a ball on this little flattened area. And then they take their opposite leg and comb the opposite side of the body, and then they pack it on that other hind leg. And that's what they use as their source of protein. So you can change it into a pollen gathering and storage. You can do other things. You can, as my granddaughter would say, you could accessorize the leg with other options. Here's an aquatic beetle. The males have suction cups on the front legs, and this is very useful for grasping the female in the water for courtship and mating. Or you can accessorize and hang on your eardrum. So crickets and katydids, they actually have their eardrum on their front leg. And this is just a little film of exoskeleton. Just like your eardrum, it vibrates when sound waves hit. So sound waves would hit, it vibrates, the nerve goes up the leg, up to the brain, and then it hears the sound. So there's other things you can add to the legs, totally unrelated to running around. So highly modified legs. And once again, like the mouth parts, all these color-coded parts are the same. So all the red are the coccyx, all the yellow are the femur, all the green is the tibia. So you can take those basic parts, change the shape, change the length, add a few things or take a few things away, and have all these different kinds of specialized legs that can tell you something about the biology. Yeah, Larry.
All of those modifications done by the same insect, or is it different classes of each one that have different things?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, you say that they can change.
Yes.
Is that over periods of time, or?
That's over billions of generations and many years.
Okay, not the same guys want to be.
Not necessarily the same guy.
Okay.
And there's a lot of convergent, what's called convergent evolution. So there are other insects that have legs that look very much like a praying mantis. They're totally unrelated to praying mantises. But through evolution, through the efficiency of structures developing for a particular task, and that being a selective advantage for the insect, a lot of other insects have evolved legs like this, or digging legs. So it's not restricted to necessarily one group. But evolution in different groups of insects can converge on a common design. All right, so what are insects actually seeing and hearing and smelling? What are they actually experiencing out there in the world? They have to do the same things we do. We have to see where we're going. We have to hear things in our environment. We have to tell if we're hungry. We have to tell if we're cold. We have to find food. When we eat, we have to figure out if we're full or if we should keep eating. So insects have to do pretty much all the same things that we do. And they have vision organs, smelling organs, but they're experiencing a lot of things that we do not. So they can detect chemicals that we can't. They can taste things that we can't. They can see things that we can't. They can hear things that we can't. So I always thought it would be cool to be an insect for like an hour, just to experience everything, all the sensory input that we can only imagine. So the main organ of vision are the compound eyes. So here's a dragonfly. And they're called compound eyes because each of these little units is called an ommatidia. But each of these is an individual image-forming apparatus. And if you took this and blew it up into a diagram, Each of these would correspond to this ommatidia. So light enters, it stimulates pigment cells, and that triggers a nerve, and that forms an image. Each of these will form an individual image. So, most insects have several to several hundred. Things like dragonflies can have 30,000 of these individual image-forming units.
Are they seeing the, is each one of those seeing the same thing, or is each one's different?
I actually took that slide out. There was an old concept of vision where they would each would see the same thing from a slightly different perspective. So like if I had 30,000 of those, I would see like 30,000 of you. But now the current thinking is those are merged into a broader picture. Instead of forming, they're integrated into a single image.
It's a function of these hairs that are sitting between the
A lot of those are mechanical receptors, so they may have to do with things like sensing flight, how fast you're going, and things like that. So what does a dragonfly do for a living? It eats, and when does it eat? In the air? What time of day? Daytime, yeah. So dragonflies have great vision because they are daytime aerial predators. They're catching things in the air, running them down. So they have very, very good vision. And if you've ever tried to catch the really big dragonflies, the Ashenidae, they're a pain in the tail. They're hard to catch, right, Joe?
Yeah, this past fall there was about a field of us students and just swiping at dragonflies, and it took us forever to get them. It's not even.
So what these vision units do is they give insects really good vision over a wide arc or a wide angle in front of and even sometimes behind the head. They have what's called a high flicker fusion frequency. That's hard to say really fast. What does that mean? How many people have gone to the movies in the last year? Okay? So, when you're sitting there at the movie theater, what do you see on the screen? You see continuous motion. And for humans, anywhere from 28 to 32 frames per second, there's 32 individual movie frames going down the screen. But it's fast enough we see continuous motion. A fly would see every individual frame moving down that screen. And they can see up to 250 frames per second. These fluorescent lights, these are turning on and off, actually. This is not continuous light, but they're turning on and off really fast. Insects would be able to see that. So they see things fast. What that means is it's very good for detecting motion. A lot of people, when they catch a fly, and guys seem to think this is some test of manliness if you can catch a fly with your hand. If you creep up on it very slowly, the fly won't detect that motion. If you come in like this, it will detect that motion. You can move in really slow, they won't see that. Great for running over the ground or flying. If you're flying, you've got to see where you're going. So they're seeing things that we cannot, just in this spectrum of light. If you take something like a bee and compare it to what a human sees, of course, light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's broken into wavelengths. And on the red end of things, it's about 800 nanometers wavelength, and a nanometer is a billionth of a meter. I'll put that in for our chemists here. And very, very short wavelengths of light move into the ultraviolet, and then back here you have like X-rays. But these are very short wavelengths of light. So what humans can see is about 400 nanometers wavelength, just right into the deep violet, into the red. So we can see this spectrum of light. And of course all these combined equal white light. What does a bee see? A bee can see into the ultraviolet, but not quite into the red. So a bee is seeing yellows, blue, green, violet. They're also seeing ultraviolet light. Which begs the question, why are so many flowers red if bees aren't seeing? I can't actually see red.
bird pollinators.
There you go. So they're seeing things that we don't, or we can't see without special equipment. So they can see color, but they don't necessarily see the red end of the spectrum like we do. they see all these other things. So here's the same flowers. This is what we would see in natural light. If you put on a filter and just let in ultraviolet light, look how different those same flowers look. And you see this with a lot of different plants. Under UV light, there's very different patterns that appear. Same flower under ultraviolet light. So maybe pollinators, if you actually merge these images, you get something like this. So pollinators or insects are seeing something very, very different than what we see when we're out walking around outside. Who in here fishes? Got polarized glasses? Yes, why? It's Jim, right?
Yeah, for glare reflecting
Yeah,
off the water.
yeah, you can, it cuts it down the glare and it lets you see into the water very, very well. A lot of insects can see polarized light, and there's a natural band of polarized light that's 90 degrees to the sun. So when the sun comes up in the morning, there's a band of polarized light, 90 degrees. And as the sun traverses across the sky, that band of polarized light shifts. And insects can see that, and they can use that for navigation. Even if there are clouds covering this part of the sun, if they can see that band of polarized light, they can still navigate using it. So they're seeing things that we don't without special lenses. And I've got to switch. I actually split mine. Split this into two. Here my iCloud. So they're seeing a lot of things that we don't see. They're feeling a lot of things that we don't. So there's all sorts of what are called mechanical receptors on the exoskeleton. So if you slice the exoskeleton and look at it under a microscope, this is the dead part. This is the part you would see on the outside of the insect. And this would be the living layer of cells that makes the exoskeleton. But studded all over the body are these different kinds of receptors that provide sensory input to the insect. So a lot of insects have these movable spines or hairs. And if the wind blows or you try to sneak up on a cockroach and the cockroach runs away, what happens is you have a little bow wave or air pressure wave in front of you. And that little pressure wave will bend that little hair. And that little bending triggers a nerve, and the nerve fires. The cockroach says, you better run. Or as the insect moves and flexes, all these different receptors provide input on sensation or angle or motion. So each leg has a coxa, trochanter, femur, tibia, and 3 to 5 tarsal segments. So you've got at least 5 leg segments times 6 legs. And the insect has to know what is each leg doing? What is the position of everything? So all these mechanical receptors provide that type of mosquito feeding. How does it know when to stop? Its body is actually expanding as it fills up with blood. So there's a stretch receptor that says, stop feeding, or otherwise you're going to blow up. So, and here's our roach. So these little cerci behind have little tiny hairs. And when you sneak up on it, your pressure wave bends those little hairs, and the roach scurries off. So there's all sorts of inputs they're getting like that we don't get. Here's our mechanical receptor in the form of the eardrum again. This is called the tympanum. So on the daytime grasshoppers, the eardrum is actually on the first abdominal segment. So here's the wing. I cut the wing off because it was in the way and took a picture. But here's the eardrum. It's a mechanical receptor. Here's our mechanical receptor on the katydid, and here it is on the leg of the cricket. So sound waves come in, they hit that, it vibrates, and that triggers a nerve signal that goes up to the head so the insect can hear whatever sound it's hearing. And they're masters of chemical reception, much more so than we are. And this usually involves a hair with openings. And there are nerves that run up inside the shaft of that little hair. It's not a hair like a mammal. It's a piece of exoskeleton. And molecules will come in through those little openings and latch on to the nerve and trigger. And Typically, they're actually touching the chemical, that's taste. If it's an airborne chemical, that would be the equivalent of our smell. But they taste and smell things that we cannot. These are all over the insect. A lot on the antenna. That has a lot to do with food or assessing food. On their mouth parts, on their legs, on the egg-laying apparatus. You can take a housefly and glue it to a stick. And you can touch that housefly to a regular coat. It's got sugar in it. And its mouth parts will drop down. It's a reflex because of those chemical receptors in the feet. You can take that same fly and stick it on a Diet Coke. Nothing happens. Because it's not, there's no sugar. It's not detecting sugar. It tastes different to the fly, so it doesn't have that feeding reflex. And this chemical ability to detect different things affects so much of the life of an insect. So in terms of finding food and feeding, courtship and mating, where it's going to live, where it's going to lay its eggs, all of these factor in with some sort of chemical detection and response that the insect undergoes. Probably your masters of chemicals are male moths, which often have these very elaborate antennae, just studded with chemoreceptors, and these are designed to pick up chemicals or pheromones from females. So a lot of insects, when the female is ready to mate, she will release an attractant pheromone. This will drift downwind, and a male will pick it up. And even just a single molecule can trigger a nerve response. So if this guy is 500 yards away, and he goes, hey, someone wants to mate, and he'll start flying up that scent plume. And when he flies out, he says, time to turn back in. And by doing this, he can gradually home in on the female based on his chemical detection of her pheromone. Other things that they can experience that we don't feel, a lot of the bloodsuckers have infrared detectors or heat sensors. So things like mosquitoes can find you in the dark. They can sense your body heat. Bed bugs, ditto. You're asleep at night, it's pitch black, and they can find you based on your body heat. A lot of them, beetles. This is really cool. There are beetles that only lay their eggs in burned wood. And they actually have infrared detectors on their body that can detect like campfires, smoldering campfires, or forest fires. And then they go lay their eggs in that burned wood. A lot of things like termites or ground-dwelling insects have special moisture receptors. And they're finding more and more insects can sense the magnetic field of the Earth. And they're probably using that to orient or for navigation. So there's a lot of sensory inputs that they're getting that we don't. Yeah.
How about pain?
Pain? Insects don't have pain receptors like you and I do. So there's a little bit of debate of what they actually feel. They certainly respond to stimuli. So if you try to put a flamethrower on an insect, it will run away, or pull its leg off, it will react. But the current notion is they don't feel pain like you and I do, because they don't have the same. They don't have pain receptors like we do. So if you smash one, don't feel bad. And I actually got that from my former department, and it was a physiologist, and I had asked him about that kind of in one of my classes. So from the expert is they might feel something, but they don't feel pain like we do. Let's go on.
I have a question too. How do like monarch butterflies and other long distance migrants, figure out how to stay on track?
That is the big mystery. They know that they're using light and position of the sun. They're also using magnetic fields. They found this recently in monarch butterflies. What they do, of course, monarch butterflies we use as our example. They migrate, the ones east of the Rockies funnel down to Mexico, and the mountains not too far from Mexico City. And that's stimulated by cooler temperatures and lower light levels. What they did with monarchs, figuring out the magnetic part, is they took monarchs from like here in the country and transplanted them over here. And they would fly, not in the direction, but they would fly in the orientation that would have taken them to Mexico if they were still in their home. So they're using the magnetic field as a measure of orientation, but it's not a road map to get there. So if they would have flown this way to get to Mexico, if you put them way over here, they would still fly that same general direction, even though they would never get there. So, but they're finding that more and more in a lot of different insects. Now, the real question with monarchs is, so the monarch flies down to Mexico, it overwinters, and then as the spring occurs, they start moving up with the spring and laying their eggs on the milkweeds. And it might take 3 or 4 generations of monarchs to get back to Canada. How does that monarch in Canada, that's 3 or 4 generations removed, know to go back down to Mexico? That's the big mystery.
That's so cool.
So, we have all of this sensory stuff going on. What are they doing with it? A lot of them are communicating. And they're doing this for a couple of reasons. A lot of it is males who are defining their territory, because we're males. We got to define our territory. A lot of them are attracting to mate, or they're using this for some sort of defense. And they can do this, you see these chemical cues. So you see a lot of chemical things going on, chemical communication. You see a lot of visual. A lot of insects use sound or vibration. Or it might be combination. It might be like a long-term pheromone, which is chemical. And then when they get closer, they might use vision. So there's a lot of things that might overlap. So pheromones, big in insects. Very, very old means of communication. There actually haven't been any pheromones found in humans, but that doesn't keep people from buying them. They help them with mating. But a pheromone is a chemical that's used within a species that benefits both parties. And in the case of mating, both benefit. But there are pheromones that cause alarms. A lot of think about honeybees. When you kill a honeybee or disturb a honeybee, it can release a pheromone that alarms the hive and promotes a defensive reaction. A lot of insects have aggregation pheromones, where if one finds a food source, it will draw others in. Things like ants, they trail mark, so they dip their stinger out every now and then and leave a chemical trail for their nest mates to follow. And of course, big on sexual attraction and courting. So we're going to look at just one quick example of sort of that tie-in between plants and chemical communication with the salt marsh caterpillar. Here's the caterpillar. It feeds on a particular type of plant. This plant has defensive chemicals, but the moth has evolved where it takes those plant chemicals and it uses those plant chemicals to make its sex pheromone. And in this case, it's the male. So it needs this plant and the plant chemicals. The male needs that to make his pheromone and his pheromone gland. Here's the adult. And when it's mating time, the males evert their pheromone glands. So here's the rear end of the male. These are normally in the body. These are his pheromone glands. But he everts those pheromones. And the males will gather in sort of a male singles bar. Hey baby, look at me. And the female will fly by and she selects her mate based on how large his pheromone gland is and how much pheromone he's producing. So if he gets on the right host plant and he gets the right plant chemicals and converts those into a big pheromone glands and a lot of pheromone, he will get to mate. So here's a normal male. This male was raised on the wrong plant, so he has smaller pheromone glands. He's not making so much. This guy won't go home lucky. Now that sort of shows the interplay of how insects have used plants or used chemicals and turned them around to their own biology. A lot of species go solely on vision. So a lot of these markings on things like butterflies, even when you think about dragonflies and damselflies, they have dark patterns on the wings. A lot of that are species-specific markings where they recognize each other as being of the right species to try to court or mate. We're all familiar with fireflies. Excuse me, I'll get a drink. And these guys are producing self-produced light, which is bioluminescence. And what you find are males have 2 abdominal segments that produce light, and females have 1. This is a great chemical reaction. They take a chemical called luciferin, add an enzyme with some oxygen that splits it and produces light. This is 98% efficient. So your average 60-watt incandescent light is only about 10% efficient. Most of the energy is lost as heat, but most of the energy is given off in this reaction as light. And this is a species-specific visual signal system. So just think about if we were in total darkness and we all had flashlights and we were all flashing messages to each other. This is essentially what they're doing. Now what you typically see is the males are shown in blue and the female flashes are shown in red. And notice the patterns. Each species has its own specific pattern of flashing to attract the right female of the right species. So these are 1-second blocks. So this male gives a couple of flashes over a 6-second span. And then the female immediately responds with their own little really short signal. This species gives a pretty long flash about 5 seconds apart, and the female waits about 4 seconds and gives her corresponding responding flash. This guy does a bunch of really short flashes, and the female waits a very long time before she flashes. So these species will recognize the appropriate flash to find the appropriate female for mate. And these just show some different flash patterns. Our very common species is this one. The male flashes and then flies upward with a J shape. That's the one that usually comes out in June and July, sometimes into August. This one hops along on the ground, it flashes, it'll fly, it'll land, it'll flash, it'll fly, it'll land, it'll flash. This guy's constantly advertising. So visual communication using a very nice, fairly simple chemical reaction.
Greg, how many species do we have around here? Or just approximate, okay?
I won't even give you an approximate number because I could be way off. We have several species around here, and we have a retired entomologist from our department who is an expert on these, and he actually did a walkout here last May. Was that when the ESA meeting was here?
I don't know if I was here.
Oh, okay.
Before my time.
But I could find out. We have several species around here. So another way insects can communicate with vision is as a defensive mechanism. So there are a lot of insects that have something nasty about them. They taste bad or they have a stinger. And a lot of them have what's called aposomatic color, which is a bright warning advertising, contrasting colors that tell a potential predator, don't mess with me. I taste bad, or I sting you, or there's something nasty about me that you don't want to mess with. Anyone recognize this caterpillar?
Monarch.
Yay! So monarchs, they feed on milkweed, they taste bad, and that aposomatic color is carried over to the adult. So notice bright warning colors. That's why you have red and yellow and green stoplights. That's why, what other animals are aposomatically colored?
Snakes.
Snakes, coral snakes.
Sorry,
Red, yellow,
I'm
black.
not sure what you said.
Ants, bees, wasps. You see red and yellow and black in some sort of combination. So these are nature's warning colors. And if you feed a monarch to a bird that's never eaten one, like this blue jay, it'll eat the monarch. They usually pick the wings off. They eat the monarch. And then they get sick because of the chemicals that the insect got from the plant and uses as part of its defense. And then the blue jay barks, and it has learned a lesson. It has learned, do not eat something that looks like this. So that is defensive visual and chemical processes in action. There are a lot of things that will mimic aposematic things. So here's a viceroy butterfly. They have recently found these actually have some chemical defense. But look how closely this mimics the monarch butterfly. So this blue jay, if it sees this perfectly palatable butterfly, if it has learned its lesson, it will likely let that one go and not try to eat it. So another form of visual communication. Sound. We talked about eardrums. A lot of insects use sound, particularly those at nighttime. Or they use vibration, and they produce different sounds that their species or other insects can hear. So here's a cricket raising its wings and calling. Here's a tree cricket that has raised its wings and is calling. And once again, these are often males that are defining their territory. Other males, don't come here, this is a nice spot. Hey ladies, this is a nice spot, come visit me and let's mate. So what are they hearing? So sound is of course just a pressure wave of different frequencies. And very low frequencies are things like 30, 40, 50 hertz or cycles per second. So in the car that pulls up next to you and his subwoofer is throbbing your whole car, you know, that's very, very low frequency sound, about 50 hertz. And then up into the ultrasound is about 20,000 cycles per second. And then you have really high-pitched sounds that we can't hear. Humans can hear about 50 to 20,000 cycles per second. So our range of hearing is about here. And the older we get, we lose that ability to hear the really high-pitched noises. So what do animals hear? So here's humans. So let's look at some insects. Moths. We're hearing a lot of things moths hear, but look, they're hearing up to 100,000 cycles per second. Very, very high-pitched noise that we don't hear at all. Crickets, grasshoppers. They're hearing all these things that we cannot. So here's a katydid, and if you look at the base of the wing, there's what's called a scraper and a file, and it rubs those two together at the base of the wing, and that's how it creates its chirp. And very, very good. Of course, sound would be very good for nighttime. Your daytime grasshoppers, on the inner edge of this hind leg on the femur, they have a little row of pegs, and they scrape those pegs against the edge of the wing, which would be like me scraping my comb if these are the little pegs on the edge of this lectern. And that's how they're creating their call with these little stridulatory pegs. So what are they actually doing sound-wise? If you look at this tree cricket, this is a snowy tree cricket. If you watch Big Bang Theory, and it was on this other week, where there's a tree cricket and Sheldon says it's the snowy tree cricket, and Wallowitz says no, and they find that the entomologist. This is the one that they were talking about. This is the sound that sound engineers in Hollywood, they always put the sound in the night scenes. When you hear the crickets calling at night in some movie, this is likely the one they use. And this is a 1 second block. So this is a 2 second span of time. And these are the strokes. And for some reason my sound file is not in bed. So let me crank up my volume here. Let's see if we can play. So this is the tree cricket. So we heard several chirps, but actually, it's a number of noises very close together in time. And if we listen to that katydid, it's a very different noise.
It's like a maraca.
And this was the katydid noise. So these are very species-specific sounds that these insects are using to communicate with each other. So when you're out there in the daytime and you hear all these different grasshopper calls, or you're out there at nighttime and you can hear all these crickets calling, think about all those different species that are essentially talking to each other via sound. And often sounds that we can't hear. A lot of moths, of course, are nocturnal. Aposematic color doesn't work at night because it's dark. And moths have evolved some really, really cool sound defenses. And of course, a major predator of moths are bats. So bats broadcast sonar, so they're sending out these high-pitched sound waves. The sound waves hit the moth, bounce off, and the bat can home in on the moth in pitch black. So many moths have eardrums, and they can hear the sound of a bat approaching or hunting, and they can take defensive measures. But some moths have evolved a counter signal, and they have a structure called a tymbal. And here's an SEM of a tymbal on the side of a moth. This broadcasts a sound that tells the bat, I taste bad, so don't eat me. So even in pitch blackness, or pitch dark, the moth is telling the bat via sound, I taste bad, I have a chemical defense, don't even waste your time eating me. And there's some cool videos online. You see, they show a bat catching a normal moth, and then the bat trying to catch this unpalatable moth. And you see the bat veer off. You hear the sound, and you see the bat veer off at the last moment. The ultra cool aspect of this is now there is acoustical mimicry, and they have found moths that taste good, but they have evolved to send out this taste bad signal. So it's actually an acoustic mimicry. They've also found some moths that can actually jam the sonar signal of the bat by sending out waves that cancel the bat frequency. So there's all sorts of cool biologies and interactions and communications. So, so really, insects are seeing things that we don't see. They're smelling things we don't smell. They're tasting things that we don't taste. They're hearing things that we don't hear. And the closest analogy I can get is if you're familiar with the movie The Matrix. Neo evolved to the point where he could see the underlying code that made up that virtual world of the Matrix. This may be what insects are seeing. They're seeing stuff that we don't. And they're experiencing all these sensory inputs that we are not. You want to take a break? This will be my last little segment. Do we want to take a little break? Or
muscle
want to
through.
go on?
Muscle through.
I'm just thrilled. Okay. All right. So we looked at why insects are successful. We looked a little bit about what they're experiencing in their life. Well, what are they actually doing out there in the real world? They're basically doing everything the vertebrates are doing, but they're doing a lot of other things, and some things with a cool twist. So here's a picture I took many years ago at the little waterfall on Konza. There could be thousands of insects in this photo. There are going to be insects on the water and insects in the water. On the ground, under the rocks, on the trees, under the bark, on the leaves, in the leaves, underground, feeding on the roots. So there will be virtually insects in every little habitat or micro-habitat you can think of in this photograph. And they're doing a lot of things that vertebrates are doing, and that you have a lot of things that are herbivores, the plant feeders. So they're going to be feeding on flowers, on pollen, on nectar. They're going to be chewing on stems. A lot of insects mine stems, so they actually bore into a plant and feed within the stem. Some are so small, they're leaf miners. So an insect laid an egg, it hatched, the larva burrowed into the leaf, and you can see its trail as it progresses and eats its way through the leaf. So some of them are so small they can actually live inside of a leaf. Here's a mayfly nymph. So this is in the water. It's going to be grazing on plant material. So you have your basic herbivore, just like you would do with things like deer or mice. Then you also have your predators and your prey relationships, just like you would with vertebrates. So here's a ladybug larva. Here's an adult ladybug. Voracious predators of soft-bodied insects like aphids. You can actually buy 5-gallon buckets of these things and stick them out in your garden. You know, if they're adults, there's no guarantee they'll stay there. They can fly off. But this is your basic predator and prey type of relationship on a very, very fine, small level. This is a green lacewing here, also preying on larvae, preying on aphids. Then you have sort of your bigger things. So you've all seen probably cicada killers. They're hunting adult cicadas. They'll sting it, they'll paralyze it, and they'll drag it to its burrow, and it'll lay an egg on it. And the developing wasp larva will eat that paralyzed cicada. And these are very determined. I've seen them like climb up on a tree, but the cicada is so heavy they can only fly like 20 feet and they hit the ground. And they'll climb up again, and do that, and they'll climb up again. So they're very, very determined. A lot of your stinging hymenoptera are predators of things like crickets and grasshoppers and caterpillars. So you have your basic predator-prey relationship. This is a mud dauber nest. You find these in protected areas under bridges and stuff. So if this was, the wasp would hunt spiders, and it stings and paralyzes, and it makes these mud cells. And it packs those paralyzed spiders into each cell, and then it puts an egg. And that developing wasp larva will feed on the paralyzed spiders. A very slow death by 1,000 bites. That's the way it's done. But you also get things that you don't necessarily get with the vertebrates. So you have a lot of insects that are parasites. So here's a wasp laying an egg in an aphid. The egg will hatch. The wasp larva eats the aphid from the inside and kills it. It pupates and then it chews a hole, and all that's left is the exoskeleton of the wasp, of the aphid. This is a picture I just took with my little pocket camera. This is on my deck last fall. This is a butterfly bush. All of these dark brown spots are aphids that have been parasitized by this kind of wasp. So they're great for biological control. We can actually use these in an applied sense. But out there in the environment, they can suppress or control or regulate or have effects on populations like that. This is a parasitic wasp that's laying multiple eggs in this caterpillar. The eggs hatch, the wasp larvae feed on the caterpillar, and they wind up killing it and pupate. A great way to control insects, and this is called biological control. It may not actually kill the host. So this is a parasite called the strepsipterum that is very common, can be common in things like bees and wasps. And it won't kill this wasp, but they're making their living hanging out in the wasp and reproducing. So you have that parasitic aspect of ecology. Then you have those blood feeders that are essentially ectoparasites, or feeding on blood and sometimes internally on tissue. So we're all familiar with mosquitoes and things like black flies. We'll make ticks honorary insects because they're arthropods. So all of these are feeding on the blood of typically vertebrates out there in the environment. Many of them, because they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, are also very good at vectoring diseases or pathogens. Very often when they're feeding, they're injecting that saliva or anticoagulants, and they're injecting pathogens. From a human aspect, malaria kills about 1 million people a year. Yellow fever kills about 300,000 people a year. So from the human aspect, from the animal aspect, there are so many diseases that are spread by, particularly things with piercing, sucking mouth parts. You may have parasitic insects that may not kill animals, but they certainly don't make them comfortable. These are nasal botfly larvae in the nasal passages of a deer. These are horse bots in the stomach of a horse. How tough do you have to be to spend 9 months of your life in the stomach of a horse? That is some pretty tough living conditions. But that is what they have evolved to develop. These are screwworm maggots that are living in the wound of some animals. In large numbers, these will actually kill an animal. And these used to be a huge problem in the U.S. And in the 1950s, they started a program where they started pushing screwworms down down into Texas, down into Mexico, down into Panama. And any animals that come in, ports of entry, they're screened for screwworms because these literally cost ranchers millions of dollars per year. So there's that aspect that you don't typically see with vertebrates in the form of parasites or spread diseases. Pollinators, very, very hot topic right now. Of course, there's bees, there's butterflies, there's flies, there's moths. All of these are very important for pollination of angiosperms. And there's big concern because, of course, you've probably heard about things like colony collapse disorder and how pollinators are starting to become scarce. This is no surprise because a lot of pollinators and wild bees, we know their numbers have been declining for a number of years. And it's actually prompted several years ago, National Academy of Science Blue Ribbon Panel. They got a bunch of famous bug people and ecology people on there. And they came out with this publication about pollinators in the USA, in North America. No one knows why a lot of these pollinators are disappearing. Colony collapse disorders has been around for a little while. In honeybees, basically the bees started disappearing from the hive. And this affects about up to a third of the hives in this country. It's also in other parts of the world. When bees fly off, they don't come back. Nobody knows why. Someone said if all the bees disappear, if the honeybees disappear, we would starve to death. That's just bogus. Because a lot of our basic crops are wind pollinated. So think about things like wheat and corn and stuff like that. They don't need bees. But a lot of the things we do like to eat are pollinated by bees. So if you like things like almonds and watermelons and citrus fruits, there are some very serious possible scenarios, with bees really combined. But no one knows why this is happening. Some people have blamed insecticides. Some people, there was a really crappy Indian publication that was cell phone towers. No, not transporting bees. Some people are blaming genetically engineered crops. Europe has banned a class of insecticides known as neonicotinoids because they think that's very detrimental to bees. A lot of people are thinking maybe it's a combination of these factors. If you have a genetically engineered crop and the BT, the toxic part is in the pollen, and maybe the bee's been exposed to some insecticides, and maybe it's got mites on it. Maybe it's a syndrome, or it takes a combination of factors. But no one, your government is throwing a lot of money at it. So there are good people working on it. Yeah, Joe.
The honeybees that we think of are naturalized from Europe, but
Yes.
how about native bees? And why?
There's a lot of native bees that are declining, particularly bumblebees. And once again, no one knows why. There are some species of bumblebees that were present, 50, 60, 80 years ago that aren't there anymore.
Greg?
Might be land use change. Yeah.
When the bees abandon their hives and they go off someplace, do they colonize someplace else? Or they
No,
just-
no, 'cause those are workers that are not reproducing. The workers are leaving. The interesting thing is, you can't look at a hive and tell if it's suffering from colony collapse disorder. But there are hive parasites. There are beetles and there are moths that will infest hives, and they'll feed on like the wax or the honey or the bees. They can tell. They will not enter a hive. There's something they can detect. They can detect there's a problem with the hive, and they won't go in. So they're sensing something that we haven't figured out yet.
Do people sit there and witness them just abandoning it, or is it kind of like over time they just kind of start leaving?
They can mark bees, and they can mark bees and say they're gone, or they'll see the number of workers is going down. And if you don't have enough workers to sustain the hive, it'll die out. So no one knows what's going on, but they're spending a lot of money trying to figure it out. The other thing you get from an ecological standpoint are the decomposers. What happens to those dead deer you see by the road? You see tons of flies on them. So think about all the animals that are out there dying on a daily basis. And these are nature's garbage nets. So you have things like flies that move in pretty fast. You have dung feeders that move in. You have things that will burrow up from the ground. You have things like termites that are feeding on decaying plant material or dung. So they're recycling. There's a lot of energy. This is actually dung beetles. This is actually bison dung on Konza. The butterflies are probably getting little salts and some moisture. But all these things, there's still a lot of energy. There's a lot of nutrient locked up in this carcass. And these scavengers and decomposers are getting those nutrients and that energy locked up in there back into the nutrient cycle. And this is just something I grabbed out of a general article. There's an estimated $57 billion of essentially ecosystem services in the form of pollination, dung removal, food for animals that insects provide just in this country. Not a small number. And I mentioned mutualistic interactions. So there's our bees, our ants and the aphids. These are actually Lycaenid butterfly larvae. A lot of these are dependent on ants, as they live with ants as part of their life cycle. They produce a chemical, kind of like meth. The ants go crazy for it. They secrete these tasty little secretions that the ants lick up and feed on. And these will actually live down in the hive with the ant in the ant nest and come up during the day. And the ants take care of them. So there's a lot of cool mutualistic interactions. I mentioned how plants and insects have evolved together. A lot of plants, when an herbivore feeds on them, the natural enemies, the predators and the parasites, they can detect the saliva of the herbivore or the poop, the frass of the herbivore, and hone in on that. They also know that plants, when they're attacked, many plants also send a chemical signal that attracts the natural enemies. So the plant can essentially send a chemical SOS that draws in the predators and the parasites that will attack the herbivores that are feeding on the plant. So there's all sorts of wonderful chemical ecology scenarios that I can tell you about. That we'll probably spend another year talking about. But there's a lot of chemical ecology and ecological interactions that take place between multiple species and multiple organisms. There's our mimicry thing again. Who's the fly? Who's the bee? So here's the fly. It doesn't have a stinger. It's perfectly harmless, but it gains protection by looking like something that does have a stinger, and some predators won't mess with it. Who wants to eat a snake? This is just a caterpillar that mimics a snake for protection. So take this. I mean, look at that. You got eyes. You got a mouth line. Flip this same picture over. Here's our caterpillar. Here's the head. Here's the legs. It just puffs up the thorax and hangs upside down and looks like a snake. Yeah. Camouflage. Very, very big in insects. Here's a grasshopper. Looks like a little pebble. Here's a caterpillar along the midrib of this leaf. Who wants to earn $1? No one wants to earn $1? I got $1. Someone come up and point out the insects in this lower photo. Hurry up, bright shiny $1. I'm not going to tell you. You have to earn your $1.
Is there just one insect?
You had my class last. No one wants to earn $1 for. Come point them out. Stand up, come up, point them out. All
Go
right.
Nancy.
Nancy's brave. You can buy Myron a cup of coffee. All right, point out the insects. 1.
Oh, I'm supposed to get more than one?
There's more than one.
Oh, I'm sure there is. There's probably one right there.
2. No.
Oh, getting hard on me.
All right, you got 4. Well, I'll give you a buck. Got 3. No, but take 4. Camouflage. Here's one grasshopper. Here's another grasshopper. Here's another grasshopper. Here's another grasshopper. And you can find stuff like this in your own backyard. I mean, this is a cool photo, but this is stuff that's all around us with insects. So you can actually use this in an applied manner, because a lot of insects are used as bioindicators, or you can, depending on the insect that's there, you can make some statement about the ecological health or status of a particular area or a particular ecosystem. In the aquatic world, they use what's called EPT, which stands for 3 groups of insects: Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. These have nymphs that live in water, and the adults will be found close to water. And these are known, each species is known to have a different tolerance level to pollution. So you have some that need really, really clean water, some that can take mildly polluted water, and some that can live in gunk, like Flint, Michigan water. And they can go in and look at the species that are there and make some sort of assessment about the health of that aquatic system. So the E stands for mayflies. Here's the adult, here's the nymph. The nymphs are aquatic. So these are known to be intolerant to stuff like pesticides or acids. Plecopteras, they need a lot of oxygen. So a lot of organic pollution robs the oxygen, or lowers the oxygen content of water. And then here's the caddisfly. Essentially, it's an aquatic caterpillar. So they can go in and see what species are there and do some very simple statistics. I got this information from Matt Wiles, who used to be an ecologist here. He's now at Southern Illinois University. And he just did a little student project looking at 2 creeks. This is the creek that runs through campus. Here's the Leadership Studies building. There's that little creek that runs through. And here's Konza Prairie. Everyone knows what this creek is. Here's the parking area and the nature trail. So they just went in and did a little project, a little EPT analysis. On the campus creek, here's our 3 groups of insects. These are genus names. But they found 60 of this genus and 2 of this genus and none of this genus. And these numbers in parentheses are the known tolerance levels to pollution. And they did the same thing for Konza Prairie. So they collected 96 specimens on the campus creek and 78 specimens on the Konza Creek. This was more diverse, so that was good. And you run some simple numbers and you get a numerical score. And that translates to this index of water health. So the campus creek was 3.6. It was pretty clean. And the Konza Creek was very, very nice. Excellent. No apparent organic pollution. So this is a standardized method that a lot of organizations use. So federal agencies use this. State agencies use this. Conservation agencies use this. And it provides a common means to measure across very wide areas. Everyone's doing the same thing, where you can make valid comparisons of things like water health. How do you collect them? You're only limited by your imagination. There are super duper nets, there's aquatic nets. This is my technician. He's sucking up little tiny insects out of his net. You can use lights. A lot of insects are drawn to black lights, mercury vapor lights, fluorescent lights. Car dealerships are a great place to collect insects because they're always lit up. You can go very, very low tech. Pitfall traps are easy. If you put a cover on them, a lot of insects are looking for cover. You know, particularly nocturnal insects, when daytime comes, they're looking for somewhere to hide. So if they're under a rock or something like that, you can get insects that way. You can bait traps with carrion or rotten fruit or dung, and that will draw in the insects that feed on those types of materials. Pan traps are popular, so you can use different colored, essentially just little plastic bowls or containers. Put a little water and a little detergent to break the surface tension, and insects will be drawn to those. You can mimic flowers. These are bee bowls that are elevated. They're essentially little cups or ramekins that are painted different colors that will mimic flowers, and bees or other pollinators will be drawn to those. Lepidopterus will take wine, red wine, and soak a rope and stretch it, and that will draw in butterflies and moths. If it's really boring, you can just drink the wine. They've decoded the pheromones for about 400 species of insects. And this has very heavy commercial application in things like crops or citrus orchards, where they can put in a pheromone trap and they can monitor for the presence of pests that that particular pheromone is specific for. And they'll monitor for the presence, or they'll try to trap them out. If you ever hear about fruit flies in Florida or Southern California, that has huge economic ramifications, because if fruit flies show up in California oranges, a lot of states will say, we're not importing California oranges. And that's a huge economic loss for California. So there's a lot of economics involved with stuff like this. Down in the tropics, they do things like canopy fogging, where you have trees that are 100, 200, 300 feet high. You can't get up there. So they will stretch out sheets or big funnels, use a quick-acting insecticide like a pyrethroid, kills the insects, they fall down on the sheets, and you collect them and figure out. Berlazy funnels are used for soil or terrestrial insects. You scoop up a leaf litter, the top couple of inches of soil, you put it on a mesh, and there's just a light bulb as a source of low heat. And as the soil dries out, insects will move down and fall into a little jar of alcohol. Now, Joe.
With the canopy fogging, do they ever just use smoke or anything where the insects might drop?
No, they use insecticide. They want to kill them.
Right.
Kill them fast. So this is really good for finding things that a lot of people are not even aware of, that are in the leaf litter or the top couple of inches of soil. I've used Malaise traps a lot. This looks kind of like a Texas Aggie tent. It only has one wall. I went to A&M, so what happens is this essentially has a single wall, and when a lot of insects hit a barrier, they tend to move upward. So an insect flying along here hits that screen in the middle, and then it gets funneled upward into a jar of alcohol. And it's great. It's out there 24 hours a day. It's very good for collecting insects. This is one over not far from Hokinson. That's one of my former grad students. You can also put pans under it. So here's the barrier. Insects hit that, they fly upwards, and then fall into the alcohol. You can also use pans, and different colors of pans will attract different types of insects. This is great for sucking up large numbers of insects. And just to give you sort of a handle on the numbers and diversity, this is one pan trap from Konza for one Malaise trap for 1 week at Konza. And look at all the insects. When you take out the big stuff like the clunky beetles and the moths, look at how many different insects there are that are small. And that gets back to what I said. A lot of the biodiversity and the biomass are going to be in the very, very small insects. I took that sample, I picked out everything but the flies. So this is just the flies from one trap from 1 week out here at Konza. And there's just marvelous biodiversity. Just to show you the numbers you have to deal with. If you ever start sampling for insects, you have to be prepared that you're going to get a lot of them. And you have to do something with all those insects that you collect. This is Alyssa Wu. She was one of my REU students 10 years ago. She's now an environmental educator at the Bronx Zoo. Amazingly studying biology. She really didn't want to be here for the summer. But we ran some hand traps and a Malaise trap in these two watersheds to compare them. This is like a 1 year or 2 year burn, and this is a 20-year burn. Yeah, 2-year burn, a lot of grass, 20-year burn, a lot of other stuff. But in 21 days of collecting, we collected over 13,000 hymenoptera. Just the hymenoptera, just ants, bees, and wasps. 21 days of collecting. So we had to sort through and identify 13,000 hymenoptera. That's not counting, beetles and grasshoppers and butterflies and everything else. That's just one group of insects. So that when people start doing inventories or surveys, they have to deal with a lot of specimens. How many species of insects are there in Kansas or even Konza? I don't have this long. Nobody knows. Because there hasn't really been sustained efforts to document and inventory questions like that. There are some very good checklists that are online or available online for smaller groups of insects. So there's a list of species found on Konza. There's a list of the grasshoppers. There's been some beetle things and some aquatic things. Those tend to be sort of the bigger and showier types of insects. This is just what's available on the KEEP webpage. It shows lists of the species of things like grasshoppers and butterflies. Talk to Jill. It's the Konza KPBS website, and then there's the KEEP section. There has been some survey work. This is a wasp guy. He was sampling different types of prairie with Malaise traps, and he was out here several years ago. This is Burkonidae. This is a Burkonidae wasp. It's a parasite. He collected, so in his collecting period, he collected 293 specimens. That's no big deal. But 86 different species. So every third or fourth specimen was a different species. That's great biodiversity. And he was looking at prairies in Illinois and Missouri. Konza was the most diverse for this particular kind of wasp. There's been a lot of other sort of piecemeal types of work. So there's new species in insects are cheap. And there's probably about 20,000 new species of insects described every year. So my students have either described species. Other people working with insects from Konza or around here or in Kansas have found new species. This is a little parasitic wasp that was actually named for Konza that I collected that this guy at the Smithsonian described. He named it Konzaensis. Great euphonic name. My technician is a lepidopterist, and he's been collecting in Riley and Erie counties, a lot of Konza. And he's got 404 species of noctuoid moths, which to me just look like little brown moths. But we've got 404 species of them. And just when you think you got it all, some of you know Ellen Welty, she's a graduate student for Tony Jorn. She found one that was not on his list out here at Konza. So you never know. So what would it take to figure out exactly every single insect in say, a small area like Konza Prairie? A lot of years, a lot of money, and a lot of experts. And the closest thing that we have to something like that is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, ATVI, or all taxa just group biotic inventory. So there's been a concerted effort, an organized effort to identify every organism in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's been going on for 18 years at about $200,000 a year, and a number of experts in all of these different groups. So that I looked this up last week. At this point, they have 18,545 species identified. And these are plants, animals, bacteria. So here's what they found for the vertebrates. 77 fish, 44 amphibians, 40 reptiles, some mammals, a lot of plants. The little guy, 2,500 beetles, 1,800 butterflies and moths, 1,400 flies, almost 1,000 bees and wasps. All the insects, 8,700. All the other arthropods, or most of the other arthropods, spiders, non-spider arachnids, things like mice and scorpions, 324. So the arthropods in this concerted effort make up a little over half of the species that have been found. So to figure out exactly what is in a given area, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of expertise in the different areas. Okay, so here's North America, North Canada, the USA, the highlands of Mexico. This is North America. And we think we have a pretty good handle on things, but we really don't. Insects tend to get more diverse as you move towards the tropics. Costa Rica, little tiny country. More insects known from Costa Rica than all of this area. So they really, really increase in diversity in the tropical areas. I think North, I don't know how many million square miles of North America, probably 3 or 4 million square miles. Costa Rica, I don't know, probably several hundred thousand, couple 100,000 square miles. So diversity really goes up as you move toward the tropics. All right, we can quit here. I can talk just a little bit about fire if you want. Fire?
Go for it.
All right, well, fire you guys up. So, since we're out here on Konza, particularly a lot of people ask, what's the interaction of fire and insect? And really it gets down to, see, I credited you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad I put your name on there since you're here. It really depends on the species of insect that you're talking about. When it's out, when it's present in the egg, or the larval, or the nymphal, or the adult stage, and possibly what plant it is on. There has been a lot of work, sort of fragmented work on particular species or groups of species. So these are K-State people. This is a grad student. This is a Matt Wiles, an aquatic ecologist. This is a behaviorist who's no longer here. But they looked at species of grasshoppers here on Konza in burned and unburned area. And it really depended on the species and the watershed and how frequently it was burned or how long it's been since it was burned for these grasshoppers to appear, or the effect of fire on those grasshoppers. A lot of people are looking at lepidopterans and pollinators and the interaction with fire. So once again, it depends on the species and when it's out and what plants it happens to be on. But there's a lot of people looking at these effects of fire on things like butterflies and moths and bees. Here's a regal fritillary. Some people are starting to worry about the conservation status because they're not as common as they used to be. Here's the range of the regal fritillary. And this one is unusual because a lot of things spend the winter as eggs. But these actually spend the winter as first instar larvae, the youngest stage of the caterpillar. They're overwintering in the leaf litter. And they start feeding in April, and they're feeding on, who knows what plants?
Violets.
Violets, that's right. So in a winter burn, if these guys are in the leaf litter, they're not going to survive this. Eggs that are underground will, or eggs that are up high in plants, but sorry, the regal fritillaries aren't going to make it through the fire like that. This is Shelley Wiggum. She's one of my grad students. She's looking at the effect of annual burning versus patch burn grazing, which is becoming a more popular model for burning in places like the Flint Hills. And she's doing her research from about here, some private ranges in Konza, all the way down into northern Oklahoma. And she's looking at the effects of annual grazing versus patch burn grazing, which is where you divide a pasture into 3 areas and you burn each of those sections each year. So you're not having this monoculture of grass. So she's looking at these are her bee voles, we've seen that. So she's looking at the pollinators. What she has found is in patch burn grazing, she's finding twice the number of bees compared to the number of bees that are in areas that are burned annually. And she's finding much more bee diversity in areas that are patch burned. And this is because there's more variety in plants, there's more variety of vertical structure, there's more ground litter. A lot of bees are nesting in the ground compared to the annual grazing. She's doing this freakingly cool stuff. She's catching bumblebees. She sandpapers off the hair on the back and epoxies on a radio transmitter. And here's the radio transmitter on the back of the bee. And then she lets it go, and they run around with these antennas tracking the bees and where they're nesting and which watersheds they're using and stuff like that, which is really, really, really cool stuff. For butterflies, she's finding twice the number of butterflies, just numbers, in the patch burn. She's finding some species of grass skippers like this that are of conservation concern. They're not endangered, but people are noticing that they're declining in numbers. She's also seeing more things like regal fritillaries in the patch burn. And that's because, once again, there's more variety of plants, there's more variety of vertical structure, there's more leaf litter, or more litter on the ground where things can overwinter or nest. She's doing cool stuff like catching butterflies, marking their wings, letting them go, so she's doing bark recapture with butterflies. So there's a lot of people studying the effects of fire, but really what it gets down to is the species. Those that are most likely to be hurt by burning are those that are remnant dependents. Or there's a lot of what are called, postage stamp prairies, which are very small prairies. It's fairly common in places like Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, where they're just little prairie remnants. And if those are burned, and you've got something dependent on that little postage stamp sized prairie, that might be a local extinction. If they're on an uncommon host plant, and that host plant is burned up, by bugs. If you're exposed in the larval stage, so a winter fire may not hurt a lot of things. A summer fire is going to hurt a lot of things because there's going to be a lot of things that are out as nymphal stages or out as larvae in the peak plant growing season. So these guys are going to get burned up. Low agility, if you're not very mobile. If you've got wings, you can get away. If you're crawling, you're probably not going to make it. But really what it gets down to is we're getting a handle on some things, but a lot of the interactions between fire and a lot of species of insects just are not known. So, to wrap it up, sort of encapsulate everything we've learned in one slide. Learn this. There's more species of insects than anything else. Every time you're walking around, think about those little teeny guys. You're surrounded by thousands of them, but you're probably not noticing. And there's all these reasons why insects have been so successful. Exoskeleton, flying, small size, all these adaptations of mouth parts, and things like that. They're seeing and feeling things that we don't, and I can only imagine what they're actually experiencing out there. And they do a lot of things out there in the environment. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and a lot of things that birds and lizards and mammals are not doing. And final plug for bugs, what other field of biology is there that has a golden rump species?